If you're a foodie for French cuisine, you owe it to yourself to learn about Julia Child. More than nearly anyone else, she played a key role in introducing French cuisine to American audiences. Underlining Julia's impact, her kitchen is now at the Smithsonian Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. Today, we'll look at how France and French cuisine influenced her, and how she brought France's food culture to the American mainstream. So get the table ready, because we're going to dig into the delicious life of Julia Child. Julia married her husband Paul in 1946, after working together in China and Sri Lanka for the OSS in World War II. After the war, they got married, and Paul got a job as a diplomat for the US government. In November 1948, they were sent to Paris, where Paul's job was to plan exhibits touting the benefits of America's Marshall Plan. They took a boat from America to France, arriving in Le Havre and passing through Rouen before arriving finally in Paris. In Rouen, her experience eating at La Couronne was a revelatory experience, which she credits with opening her up to the world of French cuisine. They moved into a two-story apartment on 81 Rue de l'Université, an hôtel particulier, or mansion. It would be impossible to afford such an apartment today on Paul's salary, but at the time France's economy was in shambles. The 1950s was a time of change for France. Coming out of the terrible Second World War, France started slowly to re-emerge economically. When Julia arrived in 1948, the French were still rationing food. By the end of the 1950s, thanks partly to the US's Marshall Plan, France's economy had taken off, beginning the Trente Glorieuses. Julia's husband Paul had lived in France in the 1920s, so he was familiar with the culture. Paul was Julia's guide through France's culture, cuisine, and language. Julia slowly began to learn French, which was essential in an era when even Parisians didn't speak much English. With Paul now busy with his job at the US Embassy, Julia decided to take up cooking as a hobby. She had never considered herself a cook before, saying that she lacked kitchen sense. Still, in her late 30s at this point, Julia decided to take up cooking courses at the Cordon Bleu Cooking School. She signed up for professional courses, accidentally signing up for the whole year. She finally graduated in March 1951. Julia enjoyed the Parisian life, dining at the Deux Magots Café, the Grand Véfour restaurant, and many other Michelin-star restaurants. She eventually had to cut back on rich foods for her health, experiencing what she called an American stomach in Paris. Julia made many notable connections in Paris. She was friends with Ernest Hemingway's ex-wife, Hadley Richardson, and attended their son Jack Hemingway's wedding in Paris. Julia became friends with a group of gourmand ladies called Le Cercle des Gourmettes. Through this group, Julia met Simone Beck and Louisette Bertholle. The pair of women were working on a French cookbook for American audiences. They opened an informal cooking school for American women in Paris, trying out recipes for the book. Julia helped shape the book into something that American audiences could appreciate, and added many recipes herself. By 1953, Julia and Paul had fallen in love with Paris, but his contract was up. Thankfully, he was transferred to Marseille, France's second largest city in the south of France. They briefly lived at 28A Quai de Rive-Neuve, a Swedish diplomat's apartment overlooking the waterfront, before moving to a larger place, which has since been demolished. She learned about bouillabaisse, the famous fish stew from Marseille.
Bouillabaisse is a French fish chowder, and it originated on the Mediterranean in Provence, and it has those typical French Provençal ingredients of onions and leeks and tomatoes and garlic and olive oil and herbs and fish.
I tried a bowl myself in Marseille, and it's pretty good, but I'm not sure it's worth the price. In her autobiography, Julia notes the anti-communist hysteria in the US government, led by Senator Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s. Her husband Paul was questioned and nearly fired because he was wrongly suspected of being a communist. They ended up staying 1 year in Marseille, before going on to Germany and then Norway. In the early 1950s, French cooking was still very traditional in its ingredients and cooking methods. In contrast, the 1950s was an era of convenience for American housewives, with the emphasis placed on easy-to-make foods like ready-made cake mixes. There were also differences between ingredients in France and America, like the flour or even the fish. Julia had extensively researched the names of fish, which differed between France, the US, and even the UK. Unlike France, which was still recovering from the war, the middle-class American housewife had an array of appliances available to make domestic chores and cooking more manageable. While their book didn't have mainstream appeal, Julia thought that Americans who had traveled would be eager to buy a cookbook that made French cooking accessible. Still, Julia had trouble selling her book to publishers, but finally found Alfred A. Knopf, who was willing to take a risk. Alongside Simone and Louisette, Julia spent 10 long years refining recipes, making sure they were foolproof, and would work with ingredients Americans could easily find in supermarkets and make with common appliances. Finally, Mastering the Art of French Cooking, Volume 1 was published in 1959. After her husband Paul retired, Julia and Paul eventually settled in Boston, where they lived when her first cookbook was published. After a cooking demonstration to promote the book, Julia was offered a cooking show on public broadcaster WGBH Boston. Mainstream television was barely a decade old at this point, and Julia admitted in her autobiography that she didn't even own a TV at that time. The French chef debuted in 1963 and went on to have 10 seasons. Building off the success of her cookbook, Julia used her TV show to introduce American audiences to la cuisine bourgeoise in an unpretentious and approachable way. Julia communicated her love for France, her spiritual home, to audiences throughout the 1960s. Julia became one of the first celebrity chefs on television, earning an Emmy in 1966. After the end of her show in 1973, it continued to rerun on PBS stations for decades. Julia returned to France each year during vacation, staying with Simone Beck at her family's estate in Provence. She even brought a film crew one time to take footage for her show. Simone's family agreed to lend Julia and Paul a parcel of land to build a small cottage for their stays. Called La Pichoune, later shortened to La Piche, the 3-bedroom house featured a well-equipped kitchen like the one on her set in Boston. Julia and Paul spent their vacations there for decades, inviting famous chef James Beard and other notable people to stay with them. Today, La Pichoune is on Airbnb for €600 a night, but it's booked solid until October 2024. Julia wrote more cookbooks over the years. Her husband Paul, who was 10 years older than her, passed away in 1994 at 92 years old. After Paul and Simone died, she decided to give La Piche back to the Beck family. Finally, at age 90, Julia embarked on an autobiography of her years living in France. Written with her nephew Alex Prudhomme, Julia drew upon the extensive letters written by Julia and Paul to Paul's twin brother Charles when they were living in France. The exquisite details of her first meal in France, her joy at discovering new restaurants or new recipes, are captured in their original detail thanks to her meticulous note-taking. She died shortly before the book was completed, passing away in 2004 at 91 years of age. Her nephew finished the book, which was published posthumously in 2006. It was honestly a pleasure to read about her experiences living in France, the joys and tribulations of being an expat, and her mouth-watering descriptions of French food. I recommend My Life in France to anyone interested in learning more about Julia. Beyond her lifetime, she has continued to inspire foodies and gourmands for decades. The book, Julia and Julia, chronicles blogger Julia Powell's attempts to recreate Julia's recipes. The book was later made into a motion picture, starring Meryl Streep as Julia. Beyond having her kitchen removed from her house and put on display in the Smithsonian, there's no better way to illustrate Julia's legacy than being played in a movie by Meryl Streep. In France, few have heard of Julia Child. Of course, beyond her French friends, her role as a bridge between France and America is a one-way street. She introduced Americans to French cuisine. The French had already invented it. Still, I think Julia deserves to be remembered for how she shared the joy of French cooking with the world. Well, mainly America. Still, I think she elevated American food standards and made people interested in trying new foods, whether eating it or cooking it. Her experience shows how at any age, experiencing a foreign culture can change you for the better. As she said in her own words, "It has become a part of me and I a part of it, and so it has remained ever since." I think I haven't heard anyone resume the experience of living abroad in better words. If you're new to my channel, I cover cross-cultural interactions and their effects on history, culture, and geopolitics. If you want to see more videos about inspiring people like Julia, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss anything. A bientôt and bon appétit. See you next time on Cook Sci Analysis.